Welcome to the TheMediaWard podcast. Flying by plane is, by quite a margin, the safest form of transport. Safety requirements are stringent, lessons are learned when accidents occur, and these lessons lead to safer practices. However, incidents do still happen, and while sometimes these incidents have one large root cause, more often than not, it's a series of mistakes and faults that lead to aircraft accidents. In this episode, we're going to take a look at a few accidents of note, and drill down into the series of events that led to each of them. We start on the 16th of January 2002 at Selaparang Airport, located on the Indonesian island of Lombok. Captain Abdul Rozak and First Officer Harry Gunawan are preparing to depart with their Garuda Indonesia-owned Boeing 737. The plane was a little under half full, with only 54 passengers and 6 crew on board. This flight, Flight 421, is a regularly scheduled domestic flight from the island of Lombok to the city of Yogyakarta, located towards the southern end of Indonesia. January falls during Indonesia's rainy season, and the weather in the area can be severe, producing some of the most intense storms in the world. At 8:20 a.m, the flight departed Lombok and climbed to its cruising altitude of 28,000 feet. After beginning their descent at 9:10 a.m, the crew observed a line of stormy weather between themselves and the airport they were heading towards. The storm stretched upwards to a dizzying height of 62,000 feet, so flying over them was not an option. As they were deciding how to progress, they flew into some clouds, reducing their visibility to near zero. They would now have to rely solely on their weather radar for guidance on how to pierce through the storm. The aircraft's onboard weather radar probes the area in front of the aircraft and shows on a display the severity of the rain ahead. Green indicates less intense rain, red indicates more severe rain. The weather radar showed a wall of red and 3 channels of green. Of these 3 less intense portions of the storm, one would direct them through restricted military airspace, another would bring them in dangerous proximity to a volcano, while the remaining central green section had no obvious hurdles, so they decided to head for the central gap in the storm. As the 737 entered this gap in the storm, powerful turbulence shook the plane and the cabin was filled with the sound of torrential rain and hail battering the aircraft. The weather radar, previously showing a green column of safety, turned completely red. The gap they had gone for had disappeared. The pilots wrestled with the controls of the aircraft as it was shaken around by the winds and hail. The hailstorm was so severe that the aircraft's onboard terrain warning system activated. The system reacted as though they were flying into a solid wall. The engines were struggling to cope with the sheer volume of water and ice they were ingesting, and 90 seconds after entering the storm, both engines flamed out, losing all power. As the engines stopped, the electricity they provided to the aircraft also shut off. Whilst the cabin lights flickered out, the instruments in the cockpit switched over to backup battery power. The captain instructed his first officer to begin the engine relight procedure, but when the first officer attempted to reignite the engines, he was unsuccessful. The second attempt also failed. There was still too much water in the engines for them to reignite. The batteries on board only have so much juice in them, and if they kept trying to relight the engines, they would run out of battery power, so they decided to start the auxiliary power unit. The auxiliary power unit, or APU, is another small jet engine usually embedded in the tail of larger jet aircraft. It provides electrical power for the aircraft and can be useful in several normal scenarios, as well as emergency situations, such as the one encountered by Flight 421. When the first officer tried to start the APU, everything went dark in the cockpit. They had lost all electrical power. This meant that all but 3 of the cockpit instruments failed, and the aircraft became much more difficult to control as the hydraulic assistance from moving the aircraft's flight control surfaces shut off. This also left the aircraft with no radio to call for assistance, and the onboard transponder that told the local air traffic controllers where the aircraft was failed. From the perspective of air traffic control, it appeared that the aircraft had vanished in the storm. The pilots were now left in a rapidly descending aircraft, unsure of exactly where they were and with no way to call for help. As the aircraft descended through 8,000 feet, it emerged from the storm, and the pilots could finally see out of the windows of the plane. Ahead of them were countless rice paddies and a solitary river, the Bengawan. In the rapidly descending aircraft, options were limited, and only 2 minutes remained before they would be touching down. The only choice now was, where? The rice paddies would not be a good choice, but the river might offer a solution. The Bengawan wasn't a large or deep river. It was about twice the width of the aircraft and only a few meters deep, but the captain spotted a 1.5 kilometer long straight section of the river between two bridges. Passing low over the first bridge, Captain Rozak pulled the nose of the aircraft up to slow the plane as much as he could before they slammed into the surface of the water. As the 737 hit the rocky bottom of the river, the floor of the rear section of the aircraft sheared away, pulling with it the toilets, the rear galley, and the jump seats occupied by two flight attendants. The rest of the jet careened down the river, coming to rest on the rocky river floor, partially submerged in water. The aircraft had lost an engine and had significant damage to its underside, but was largely intact. 12 passengers sustained serious injuries, 10 minor injuries, and the rest escaped uninjured. Of the two flight attendants who had been ripped out of the plane, one perished, and one suffered severe injuries. Unplanned water landings are always incredibly perilous, so the fact that the majority of the passengers were left entirely unharmed is truly remarkable. The captain then used his mobile phone to call his airline's operations centre to notify them of what had happened. So, what did occur? Well, to start with, that gap in the storm that the crew were aiming for, that disappeared as soon as they entered it, never existed. It was, in fact, the most intense section of the storm, not a gap at all. Weather radar systems operate by sending out directional pulses of microwave radiation. These then bounce off of rain droplets back towards the radar receiver. By analysing how strong the return signal is, the weather radar can establish how intense the rainfall is in each section of the sky. Strong rainfall returns a stronger signal, less intense rain a weaker signal. If there is no rain ahead of the radar, there is no return, as there is nothing to bounce the signal back. However, if the rain is sufficiently intense, it entirely absorbs the signal, also providing no return. This was the case with Flight 421. The gap was not a gap, it was extremely intense rain. Jet engines are designed to fly through rain and hail, so investigators wanted to establish whether the engines on this 737 were defective, designed poorly, or whether the precipitation was simply of an unprecedented intensity. The engines of the downed aircraft were disassembled and inspected, and the only damage found was sustained during the water landing, so they had been in good working order during the incident. Intense precipitation has caused previous flameouts on this specific model of engine, as well as other jet engines in general. Design revisions had improved the engine's ability to deal with ingesting ice and water, and it had passed the legal requirements of being able to ingest 10 grams of water per cubic meter of air, without ill effect. That level of rain would indeed be considered torrential. So why did the engines fail on Flight 421? Investigators used cockpit voice recordings, engine data readings, and other information sources to establish an estimate for the intensity of the precipitation the engines were exposed to. That estimate came out at 18 grams of water per cubic meter of air. 10 grams would be torrential rain. 18 grams is truly astonishing. The British Air Accidents Investigation Branch, who analysed the cockpit voice recorders, said that it was the most intense precipitation an aircraft had ever encountered, as far as they were aware. The engine manufacturers ran some tests, and sure enough, when the precipitation level hit 17.8 grams, the engines would flame out. The engines weren't faulty, and the design was sound. They could ingest nearly 80% more water than was legally required before they failed. Flight 421 had simply encountered storms far in excess of what was expected. This left one last question. If the engines were in working order and could have been restarted when they dropped out of the clouds, why did the aircraft end up in a river? The crew had attempted to relight the engines twice, but at this point they were still in the heart of the storm. When they tried to start the APU, the electrical systems died. If they hadn't failed, there was no reason that the engines couldn't have been reignited with the power generator from the APU once they were out of the storm. The cause for the loss of electrical power upon attempting to start the auxiliary power unit came down to the aircraft's battery banks. To avoid overheating during charging, the plane's batteries had temperature sensors. However, the temperature sensor on this aircraft had become detached. As the battery was charged and discharged in normal use, it would overheat, and shortly before this fateful flight, one of the cells had split open. Because of the damage to the battery, its total power output was reduced, and after having been partially depleted by the failed engine restarts, the power draw of attempting to start the APU was just too much. The battery failed, and the aircraft lost all power. The lower than standard voltage had been noticed on the pre-flight checks, but it was still well within the required levels, so wasn't investigated further. If the pilots hadn't opted to navigate through a non-existent gap in the storm, if the storm had been even the slightest bit less severe, or if the battery had not been damaged, the flight would have continued safely. However, if the crew had started the APU first, as their checklist required, there would have been enough power in the batteries for a successful APU ignition. This would have meant that they would have enough power to relight the engines when they emerged from the storm. The weather radar showing a phantom gap was another area of investigation. The phenomenon of weather radars incorrectly showing intense precipitation as clear spots was well known, and by altering the weather radar settings, it should have been possible to identify the false readings and make appropriate corrections. In further investigation, it was shown that the air carrier's pilot training program was lacking in a number of areas, and the specifics of the weather radar and its operation was one such area of deficiency. As we've heard, it wasn't one big mistake that brought down Flight 421, but a culmination of multiple errors, from airline training management, maintenance scheduling, and the flight crew themselves. We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. It's all too easy to end up cooking the same meals day after day, grabbing a ready meal from the freezer, or worse still, resorting to takeaway after takeaway. Thankfully, HelloFresh is the perfect way to change all of this. You can get mouth-watering recipes with pre-proportioned, fresh, high-quality ingredients delivered directly to your door. No fighting your way through the supermarket aisles. No pulling a rather unappetizing ready meal out of your freezer. Instead, you'll get delicious recipes like salmon teriyaki skewers with miso stir-fried greens and sesame wedges, or turmeric roasted cauliflower with a lentil and coconut dal. Every week, there is a huge variety of tasty recipes, and you can choose what works for you. Whether you're a meat lover or more a fan of the veggies, HelloFresh has you covered. If you want to get 50% off your first box and 35% off of your next 3 boxes, you can find a referral link in the show notes. You'll also be helping the podcast out. Right, back to the show. For our next incident, we're going back to July 23rd of 1983 to Air Canada Flight 143, a domestic flight from Montreal to Edmonton, Canada. Captain Pearson and First Officer Quintal were piloting a 4-month-old Boeing 767 at 41,000 feet, about halfway through their journey, with 61 passengers and 8 crew members on board. The flight had progressed without incident until a low-pressure warning alert was received from the left-wing fuel pump. Now, this isn't ideal, but in the event of a fuel pump failure, gravity will still feed fuel to the engines, so it's a cause for concern, but it's not an immediate disaster. Seconds later, however, the right fuel pump also showed a low-pressure warning. This wasn't just a single faulty pump, it was something much more alarming. In line with procedure, Captain Pearson requested to divert to Winnipeg Airport so they could land and assess the issue. Warning alarms began to spread throughout the fuel system, and within minutes, the left engine had flamed out. The crew began working through the checklist for a single engine failure when the right engine also flamed out. A long bong that neither of the flight crew had heard before rang out in their cockpit. It was the audible alert from the flight computers warning them that both engines had shut off. The first officer started going through the checklists to find one for landing after a failure of both engines, but there was no such checklist. It was just never expected to happen. Without electrical power generated by the engines, the aircraft had to fall back onto battery power. This kept the radios working along with the most important flight instruments, but in addition to electrical power being lost when the engines died, hydraulic power was also lost. Hydraulics power a lot of core systems within an aircraft, including the landing gear, control surfaces, and flaps. Because the aircraft would be unflyable without any hydraulics, a ram air turbine can be deployed that provides partial hydraulic pressure. Essentially, a small windmill pops out and runs a hydraulic pump. This keeps the aircraft flyable, but you are limited in what you can do. You can't use hydraulics to lower the landing gear, and flaps become inoperable. So Air Canada Flight 143 is at 35,000 feet, with limited controls, no engines, and its destination, the airport of Winnipeg, is still about 120 miles away. There was, however, a glimmer of hope, as Captain Pearson was an experienced glider pilot, so he was used to piloting unpowered aircraft, just not ones of this size. The crew needed to calculate the glide ratio of their aircraft. An unpowered aircraft doesn't just drop out of the sky, it will glide, trading altitude for forward momentum. Working with their instruments and traffic control, they estimated the Boeing 767's glide ratio to be about 1 to 12, so for every mile they dropped, they would travel 12 forward. 35,000 feet equates to around 6.5 miles, so they had around 80 miles of range. Winnipeg was at this point about 100 miles away, so they needed somewhere else to land. This flight had a second stroke of luck. The first officer was an ex-Canadian Air Force pilot and knew of a closer Air Force base, RCAF Station Gimli. The airbase had been decommissioned, but the runways ought to still be intact, and besides, they didn't have any other options. They now had to prepare for landing. The landing gear was unpowered, but there is an alternative method whereby it lowers and locks into place under its own weight, so they attempted what is known as a gravity drop. The main landing gear under the wings dropped into place and locked, but the nose landing gear did not. It dropped, but didn't lock into position. In a normal landing, the flight crew would extend flaps. These flaps extend from the rear edge of the wing and increase the lift provided. They have the effect of allowing the aircraft to fly at a slower speed while still retaining control. This makes landing an aircraft safer as you can touch down at a lower speed and come to a stop within a shorter distance. Unfortunately, flaps are one of the items that are unpowered in the event of both engines failing, so they would have less control over the aircraft's descent rate and speed and would need to maintain a higher approach speed. As they entered the final approach phase of the descent, they realised they were too high and too fast. They didn't have the option of going around, and without working flaps, the usual methods of slowing the aircraft were not available to the crew. Fortunately, the captain's glider experience made another option possible. In gliders and small aircraft, you can perform a manoeuvre called a forward slip to help reduce your speed. In normal flight, the aircraft is pointed in the direction it's travelling. To perform a forward slip, you maintain your direction, but you point the nose of the aircraft off to the side, so you kind of slide through the air. This presents a greater surface area, causing more drag, and in turn reducing the aircraft's speed. This is a delicate manoeuvre in a light aircraft or glider, and absolutely not the sort of thing that would normally be attempted in a large commercial jet. Thankfully, the pilot's experience enabled him to pull off the manoeuvre, so when they reached the runway, they were travelling at a more manageable speed. However, they did spot a few significant problems. Part of the decommissioned airbase had been turned into a motorsport park, including a portion of the runway they were attempting to land on. There were also two boys on bicycles in the middle of the runway, staring up in disbelief at the approaching plane. As the plane touched down, the nose landing gear collapsed, causing the aircraft to scrape along the runway, supported by the main landing gear and the nose of the aircraft. It collided with a guardrail that had been installed as part of the motorsport park before coming to a rest. A small fire had started under the nose due to the intense friction of the landing, but this was quickly put out by the motorsport park safety staff. In the end, the nose gear collapsing was a net positive. It rapidly reduced the aircraft's speed, stopping it short of hitting anything substantial, or indeed the boys on their bikes. There were no serious injuries on board the aircraft, the only injuries being sustained upon the evacuation of the aircraft. The rear inflatable slides were not long enough to reach the ground because of the nose-down, tail-up position the aircraft was in. The aircraft became known as the Gimli glider, named after the airbase it landed at and its record-breaking 17-minute unpowered flight. After minor repairs, it went on to fly for another 25 years. In the initial investigation, it was quickly ascertained that the cause of the incident wasn't a failure of the fuel system pumps or anything of that sort. In fact, the fuel tanks were simply empty. So how did a commercial jet run out of fuel halfway through a flight? As with the previous incident, it wasn't just one mistake, but rather a cascade of errors. The Boeing 767 has a dual-channel fuel quantity indicator system, which is essentially a set of fuel gauges that tell you how much fuel is in each tank. Dual channel just means it relies on two sets of inputs to calculate how full the tanks are. This provides a layer of redundancy. The Boeing 767 had a design flaw. When one channel failed, rather than the second channel taking over and displaying the correct fuel level, the system simply shut off, giving no indication of fuel level. As you might have guessed, one of the channels was inoperative on the Gimli glider. There is a workaround, which leaves the gauges displaying the fuel levels, even when one channel is inoperative. An engineer had applied this workaround for the previous flight of the aircraft. Before the fateful flight of this aircraft, a different engineer had investigated the problem, but in doing so, removed the workaround. This left the aircraft with no functioning fuel gauges, which meant legally the aircraft should have been grounded. However, the pilot had misinterpreted the situation. Having spoken with the pilot of the previous flight, a miscommunication had led him to believe that the plane had flown without the fuel gauges on the previous flight. It had flown, but the workaround had been applied, meaning the flight did in fact have working fuel gauges. Following further communication errors with ground crew, and despite the pilot checking the legality of the situation, he proceeded with the flight, relying on a manual measurement of the fuel level in the tanks. This may have been unsafe and illegal, but it doesn't account for why the plane ran out of fuel. It accounts for why the flight crew failed to notice they didn't have enough fuel, but it wasn't the root cause. Fueling a plane is a little different to fueling your car. Fuel on the ground is dispensed by volume. In the air, due to the effects of reduced pressure and temperature, the volume of fuel can vary significantly, so the fuel is measured by weight. This means that a conversion must be made when fueling a plane. The amount of fuel required is calculated by weight, and then this figure is converted into the volume of fuel required. The ground staff had made this calculation countless times before, but they made those calculations with imperial units, pounds and gallons. Air Canada had decided to move over to metric units, kilograms and litres, and as the 767 was a brand new model, they decided to start using metric fuel calculations with the new plane. This required a different set of conversions, a different calculation sheet that the ground crew would use to record the dispensing of fuel. So even though they did indeed manually check the fuel levels in the tanks and put what they thought was the correct amount of fuel into the plane, it was only about half the correct amount, because they had made a mistake with the units, mixing imperial and metric figures. If the fuel gauges had been working, this mistake would have been identified. If the plane had been grounded, the mistake wouldn't have been made. And if the ground crew hadn't made the mistake, well, the plane wouldn't have run out of fuel. Following the incident, the flight crew and the ground crew were either demoted, disciplined, or suspended. However, after some time had passed, the flight crew received awards for the heroic effort of landing the plane intact. It can't be denied that once the emergency occurred, the crew handled the situation admirably, but it was at least partially their fault to begin with. Our last example occurred on the 10th of June 1990. British Airways Flight 5390 had left Birmingham and was on its way to Malaga, Spain. The BAC 111 had 81 passengers, 4 cabin crew and 2 flight crew on board. The aircraft was piloted by Captain Tim Lancaster and First Officer Alistair Atchison, and as they ascended through 17,000 feet, there was an explosion. Captain Lancaster's windscreen had exploded outwards. The pressurized air inside of the plane rushed out through the open hole, sending debris flying through the passenger cabin. The cockpit door came careening inwards, and the captain was pulled out of his seat and part way out of the window. When the cockpit door was blasted into the cockpit, it slammed into the center console, blocking access to the throttles, and the only thing stopping the captain from being entirely sucked out of the aircraft was his feet becoming entangled in the control yoke of the aircraft, causing the plane to enter a steep dive. Having witnessed the dire situation in the cockpit, a flight attendant rushed in and grabbed the captain around the waist, just in time to stop him being completely sucked out of the aircraft. Moments later, the pressure equalized, and a tornado of air rushed in through the open windscreen, pinning the captain against the outside of the aircraft and swirling debris around the interior of the cockpit. 2 more flight attendants entered the cockpit, one of whom removed the wreckage of the cockpit door from the control panel, finally allowing the first officer full control of the aircraft. The 2 flight attendants then relieved the attendant who was anchoring the captain in place. He had suffered frostbite from the rush of bitter cold air forcing its way into the cabin. The 2 other attendants then untangled the captain's legs from the flight controls and secured them to his seat. They attempted to pull him back inside the cockpit, but the force of the air passing over the body of the plane was simply too strong. The best they could do was prevent him from being entirely pulled out. The first officer had regained control of the aircraft and had descended to a lower altitude. As he slowed the plane and levelled out, the captain slid down the side of the aircraft until his bloodied face was pressed against the side window. His skin was grey, his eyes wide open. The crew assumed he was dead. A suggestion was made to let him go, but this was quickly forgotten. Aside from the moral dilemma, his body could strike the wings or engines and cause severe damage, so they maintained their grip on him. Now that the wind in the cockpit had lessened, the first officer was able to communicate with air traffic control, and he was diverted to Southampton. There he safely landed the plane, solo and with no aid from charts, as they had all been sucked out of the plane. Every single one of the passengers had escaped injury, but the crew had been battered. The flight attendants were treated for shock, frostbite, and a dislocated shoulder. The captain's body was pulled back into the cockpit, grey and apparently lifeless. but within minutes he regained consciousness and declared that he was hungry. Despite being half sucked out of an aircraft and battered with 600 km/h -17-degree winds, he was alive, suffering from mild frostbite, some bruising, and minor bone fractures. Just 5 months after his ordeal, he returned to work at British Airways. The pilot's windscreen had exploded outwards under the force of the pressurized air inside the aircraft, leaving one bolt still in the frame of the aircraft. The windscreen itself was found a short time later, with 11 bolts still in it and another 18 nearby. Upon inspection, none of these bolts were found to be the correct type. A windscreen on a BAC 111 should be fitted with 90 8D bolts. What was found left in the frame and in and around the windscreen was a collection of 7D and 8C bolts. 4 were 7D bolts. These were the correct diameter, but a little shorter than the correct bolts. The more alarming situation were the 26 8C bolts. These were the correct length, but were thinner than the correct bolts, meaning they wouldn't engage properly with the threading of the bolt holes. The cause of the explosive decompression had been found, but how had this happened? How did a windscreen, a vitally important component of the aircraft, get fitted with entirely the wrong bolts? Well, one issue is that according to the manuals, this wasn't considered a critical component, and as such, there was no legal requirement for work on the windscreen to be quality checked. The windscreen had been replaced a few days prior by the shift supervisor of the Birmingham Maintenance Department of British Airways. Due to a tight schedule, when the work order came in to replace the captain's size windscreen on the BAC 111, he decided he'd best do it himself. It had been a few years since the supervisor had completed this particular job, but after briefly consulting the maintenance manual, he decided that it wasn't too complex, and proceeded. The maintenance manual didn't list the bolts required for the windscreen, but it did list the bolts for the side window, which were the same diameter as required for the main windscreen, but a little shorter. There was a microfiche that listed all the correct part, but due to time constraints, he didn't consult this. He removed the existing window and noticed many of the bolts were corroded, so he decided to replace the majority of them. He correctly identified the bolts he had removed as 7Ds, but the correct bolt should have been 8Ds. Whoever had previously fitted the windscreen had used the incorrect bolts. The shift supervisor, however, hadn't realised this. Alarming though this is, the windscreen had held for 4 years. The bolts may have been the wrong length, but by less than 1/4 centimetre. The majority of the 90 bolts that hold the window in place are not there to keep it attached to the aircraft, but instead to provide a good seal, so as not to leak the pressurised air inside the cabin. The shorter than required bolts would have provided a less secure mounting, but as it held for such a long time, it probably wouldn't ever actually fail. So the shift manager went to the on-site storeroom to find the 84 bolts he needed. The storeman commented that they usually use 8D bolts on windscreens, but the shift manager dismissed the notion, convinced that the 7D bolts he pulled out were correct. When he opened the drawer that should have contained the 7D bolts, he found a grand total of 4, far less than the 84 he needed, and far less than the 50, which was the minimum stock level. After a failed visit to the manned store, he drove across the airport to an unmanned store. There, after several minutes of searching, he found what he thought were the bolts he was looking for. He took 84 of them, along with the 6 bolts he'd pulled out of the windscreen earlier. In a side-by-side comparison, these bolts looked identical, however, they were not. They were 8C bolts, the correct length, but slightly thinner. When he got back to the aircraft, he had to lean far out from the platform he was standing on, and he was using the wrong tool for the job. Neither of the correct torque-limiting wrenches were available, so he was using a torque-limiting screwdriver, jerry-rigged to drive the bolts into the frame. Because it wasn't designed for the job, he had to use one hand to operate the tool and one hand to hold the end in place, meaning he couldn't actually see the bolts being driven into the windscreen frame. Using a torque-limiting tool means you can't over-tighten bolts. When it gets to a certain degree of tightness, it slips and stops driving the bolt in. Unfortunately, the feeling of the tool slipping as it should do was almost indistinguishable from the bolt itself slipping, as it failed to properly engage with the threading of the hole. And so the aircraft left the hangar with 6 of the original bolts, which were the correct diameter but too short, and 84 newly fitted bolts that were the correct length but not the correct width. Not a single bolt in the windscreen was of the correct size. The bolt simply did not provide enough resistance to the pressure differential when the aircraft was at altitude, causing the windscreen to pull out of the plane. Investigation into the incident uncovered a number of systematic problems within the British Airways Maintenance Department. The culture was not one of get it done properly, it was simply get it done. The shift manager had a stellar safety record, but this record turned out to be misleading. The small errors he would often make were never obvious enough to be picked up, and his overconfidence in his abilities manifested in his failure to check for correct procedures. His position also compounded this. Because he was the shift manager, he would often inspect others' work, but no one inspected his work on the windscreen, partially because the windscreen wasn't deemed a critical part of the aircraft, but also because no one senior to him was around to oversee the work. On top of this, the parts department was found to be in complete chaos. A significant portion of the stock held in the parts department was lower than the required stock level, and was either mixed or mislabeled. The parts came in packaging, which was labelled. However, these packaging labels were often disposed of, and the parts themselves were stored unlabelled. Following the revelation of the incorrect bolt usage in this aircraft, 2 other aircraft of the same type in the BA fleet were found to have incorrect bolts in their windscreens. These were the bolts that were too short, but luckily none of the thinner bolts were found. The last problematic factor was the design of the BAC 111's windscreen itself. It was fitted from the outside, with many bolts holding it in place. The alternative option is a design that is secured from the inside, so that in addition to the bolts keeping it in place, the pressure from inside the cabin also holds it in against the frame. Though slightly safer, the latter design is less practical from a maintenance perspective. There were multiple chances to identify the issue, and multiple causes in the first place, which is fairly typical of aviation incidents. Following an incident, the aviation industry learns lessons, new procedures are put into place, designs are altered, things change for the better. This means that air travel has become increasingly safe, and usually, when something goes wrong, it is due to a cascade of smaller errors that snowball into a significant problem, as was the case in the 3 examples featured in this podcast. A big thank you to Admiral Cloudberg, whose in-depth analysis of air accidents I relied upon for researching this episode. If you are interested in aircraft incidents, you can find his work at admiralcloudberg.medium.com or on r/Admiral Cloudberg on Reddit. That is Cloudberg, spelt Cloudberg. If you like the podcast, you might like my YouTube channel. Find it at youtube.com/TheMediaWard. If you want to support the podcast, please rate it, subscribe, or share it with a friend. It all helps more than you might imagine. If you want to be even more amazing, perhaps you might consider supporting me on Patreon. There you'll find ad-free episodes, get access to episodes 2 weeks early, and on top of that, 1 extra episode every season. You'll also get access to behind-the-scenes content for the YouTube channel, such as extended cuts and bloopers. You can find me at patreon.com/TheMediaWard. I'd like to thank St. Valentine Music for providing all of the music you've heard in today's episode. For a full list of my sources, please visit the website at themediaward.co.uk. And one last thing. Following the retirement of the Gimli glider 25 years after its fateful accident, it was scrapped. An enterprising company purchased sections of its fuselage and cut luggage tags from it. The tagline is, "Snag some luck right out of the skies." They're actually still available, so if you fancy a rather unique piece of history, you can get one of the 10,000 tags they produced.